Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Ask the Author session hosted by the International Transport Forum at the OECD. The ITF's Ask the Author series provides quick-fire 30-minute rundowns of specific transport-related issues. This session is going out live via Zoom and is also being shown on YouTube and LinkedIn. So welcome to you all wherever you are today. Our Ask the Author sessions work like this. We invite the author or authors of a recently published ITF report to give you a brief presentation of the report's main findings and recommendations. Then we invite you, the audience, to pose questions. More on that in a second. Today we're going to talk about walking and cycling, two very different modes of transport that are often grouped under the heading of active travel, along with other human-powered modes. Walking, cycling, and other active mobility solutions can benefit cities and urban environments. In addition to the positive health benefits of active travel, these modes and the facilitation of their use can be valuable levers for improving city life. But how can walking and cycling contribute to better cities that are healthier, safer, and more enjoyable, providing residents with benefits that improve their well-being and contribute to larger environmental goals? To take us through the complexities of this question, we're joined today by John P. Pritchard and Philippe Crist. John is a modeler and analyst in the ITF Research Centre, while Philippe is an advisor for the ITF on innovation and foresight. John and Philippe co-authored the latest ITF Roundtable report, Improving the Quality of Walking and Cycling in Cities, which you can download from our website. In today's webinar, John and Philippe will take us through the main findings of the report, and then we'll provide you with an opportunity to ask your questions via the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen. But for now, over to you, John and Philippe.
Thanks, David. Thank you. We'll be sharing today this report that is based on a roundtable chaired by Professor Lake Sigarkis of the Catholic University of Chile. And this roundtable looked at the justification for and the strategies to preserve or increase levels of cycling and walking around the world. Now, if we're interested in walking and cycling, it's because they constitute, as we've heard, active forms of travel. Active travel encompasses all forms of mobility that require physical exertion on our part to move. Active travel is essential in delivering well-being and prosperity. And in our report, we summarize the latest evidence regarding these benefits. These include benefits relating to efficiency. We point out that the measures of traffic efficiency must be expanded to account for how well people, as opposed to vehicles, move in cities. Not only are walking and cycling highly space-efficient modes of transport, but cycling allows travel at comparable or better speeds than car traffic at the times of day when most people move, in the areas where most people move, and for the distances that most people are covering. Cycling and walking also help to make longer distance public transport more time efficient. Active travel contributes to equity when it's facilitated and provided for in a safe, secure, and comfortable and welcoming conditions. Cycling and walking is physically and economically accessible to most and improves accessibility, especially in conjunction with public transport. Active travel minimizes the use of energy and materials required to move people, and it produces no greenhouse gas emissions in its use and minimal greenhouse gas emissions over the full life cycle. For example, electric cars, walking, bicycles, and e-bikes compared to electric cars, walking, bicycles, and e-bikes consume 15 times less, 27 times less, and 11 times less energy per kilometer at typical speeds. And finally, active travel, walking and cycling are key determinants of well-being and societal prosperity. The contribution of active travel to increased physical activity reduces poor health outcomes across a wide range of endpoints. It decreases premature deaths associated with low activity, and it reduces the negative health impacts of excessive sedentary activities. It also contributes to improved mental health and happiness. The balance of physical activity-related health benefits is orders of magnitude greater than the combined disbenefits linked to crashes and exposure to air pollution. Taken all together, every kilometer walked and cycled benefits society, while in contrast, every kilometer driven imposes external cost on society. Nonetheless, while all benefit from maintaining or increasing active travel in good conditions, not all benefit equally. Different contexts play an important role in the distribution of benefits and the allocation of burdens, and this must be accounted for. The benefits are clear and compelling, and yet walking and cycling are rarely at the forefront of transport policy. Why that is can be traced to two somewhat paradoxical phenomena. Ask most people to describe what they see when looking at a street, and most will list a number of things, including other people, buildings, activities, trees, the sky. But most people over the age of 5 will not consciously notice or describe to you the wall of steel parked at curbs and moving on our streets, cars, vans, trucks, all taking up much of the public space in our cities, but not registering in our minds. We are, in a way, car blind. And at the same time, looking at the same street, when we are behind the wheel or when we make engineering and policy decisions, we wear car blinders. We view, when we plan, when we allocate space, when we consider what is normal, when we assess risk or think about traffic and life in our cities, we adopt an unspoken but deeply embedded prioritization given to large, fast motor vehicles. Now, to be clear, the car has given much that is good and much that is worth keeping, but too much of even a good thing can be bad, and we're clearly at that point in most cities around the world. Improving the quality of walking and cycling in cities cannot take place unless we address how the car has become so embedded in our daily lives. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Philippe. This car blindness and these car blinders that Philippe mentioned are really a manifestation of moto-normativity, where we not only assume that the car is the default, but assume that it will continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. The consequence of this is that it makes it difficult to assess the role of the car objectively, and therefore it often results in unequitable outcomes. Two key areas where this is readily apparent is in regards to space allocation and in road safety. Philippe, if you go to, I have to the next slide, please. In cities, the reality is that In cities, the reality is that most road space is ceded to motorized vehicles, and while the car may be very efficient in terms of speed and open roads with no congestion, in dense urban environments, it's extremely inefficient in terms of space use. For the equivalent trip, a car would use 28 more times more space than a pedestrian and 7 times more space than a cyclist, for instance. And a lot of the space is used up while the car sits idle on our public roads. Similarly, if we look at road safety, the way we discuss it often actually hides the directionality of these impacts. The data is clear. People driving cars and other large motorized vehicles are the ones that are injuring and killing other road users in urban areas in collisions. Because we really should be talking about accidents. We should really be talking about the collisions. And oftentimes who's injured by these are really pedestrians and cyclists, and it should be noted, other drivers as well, as you can see in the figure. So now, how can we change this? And how can we move from car-centric cities to more people-centric cities where we focus on how people move and not how vehicles move? It's easy to focus on big transformations, on transport infrastructure development, but the reality is that it's not enough. If we want to move from this to this, we really need to look beyond infrastructure. We need to consider how people make their decisions and understand that travel decisions aren't happening in a vacuum. People's individual situations and preferences obviously play a role, but these decisions are not always rational, for lack of a better word, and we have to think about how people make these decisions. Additionally, modal characteristics also play, and their availability play an important role, and of course, the context where people live is also important. And here, what we always have to keep in mind is the fact that violence often mediates everyday mobility. Although in a perfect world, our travel intents and desires would translate to the intended travel behavior, the truth is that this doesn't always happen. And you have all sorts of different types of violence, including gender violence, criminal violence, policing violence, and road traffic violence that alter our mobility in some way and often constrict it entirely. So we want to move beyond moto-normativity and recenter mobility based on people. We have some important recommendations that we kind of provide in this report. The first is that there's too much focus on increasing the amount of walking and cycling in cities. But we think that it's much more important to focus on improving the quality of the existing walking and cycling that already at hand. Because the reality is that in many contexts, and especially among underprivileged groups in many different areas, people already walk too much and have very strenuous mobility, that they're looking to minimize that. So really, if we ensure the dignity, safety, and well-being of those already walking and cycling, even under adverse conditions, we could really put in place conditions for others to walk and cycle more. Additionally, it's also key to democratize urban mobility space so that we can ensure that citizens can safely and securely travel in more ways without compromising their safety, health, and comfort. As I already mentioned, too often too much space is allocated to car users, meaning that only those wanting or able to travel by car are actually being served. Also, it's absolutely critical that we incorporate violence reduction as a critical transfer policy goal. Too often, transport and planning professionals and policymakers think that this is outside their purview. But the reality is that although context matters and the degree and the way in which violence manifests itself is different in different cities, this is a universal problem that not only affects women and underprivileged groups, but also all of us in all contexts. This is data here that I have from the EU, because often it's very easy to kind of believe that it only happens in other places and only happens to other people. So understanding that this is a universal problem is key. Additionally, we really need to remove car blindness from project appraisal to consider a broader range of alternatives. And we do this to ensure that we don't reinforce the existing system where we keep reinforcing the value that the car kind of is given within policymaking. Additionally, what this means is that we need to remove motor-normative policies to increase the effectiveness of active mobility policy. It's not enough to embed active mobility policies in contexts where the car is still being prioritized, because it's unlikely to deliver good outcomes under this. So you have to take away the policies that are really prioritizing the car. Additionally, and I think this is really, really important, is the fact that we need to decouple active mobility to focus on the different needs that pedestrians and cyclists may have. There are obviously some strategic reasons to discuss all active travel together, but we have to ensure that we address the needs of different modes and we don't further marginalize pedestrians as we increase other wheel-based active travel. Finally, you need to tailor your solutions to your local context. Obviously, learning from others is important, but importing solutions without context is unlikely to work. You don't need to be the next Amsterdam or the next anything. What city needs are solutions that are tailored to the needs and wants of their citizens. Thanks a lot, and we're open to any questions.
Thank you very much, John and Philippe, for that very, very swift run through of what is really a very complex and rich report that's full of lots of details and observations and examples from all around the world. Now is the time for you as the audience members to join us in this discussion by using the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to one or both of our authors, please go ahead now and use that Q&A function. Perhaps while we're waiting for people to start asking questions, I can pose a question of my own. John, in the recommendations there, you talked about decoupling active mobility. So, separating policies that are aimed at improving the quality of walking from policies that improve the quality of cycling, for example. Can you give us a little bit more of an insight into what might be the different policy needs or policy focuses that would be required to improve walking as opposed to cycling?
Sure. I think that walking is a much more massive mode. It's a mode that really kind of is used by a lot of people, but these are often like short trips. And so oftentimes the needs of pedestrians are very different than the needs that you have for someone who's cycling or who's using a small scooter. Because so if you don't separate what a pedestrian needs versus what a cyclist needs, where a cyclist is perhaps looking to go from point A to B, while a pedestrian might just be kind of just walking around for the city to enjoy the city, walking around for a small errand close to their house, what happens is that you end up pushing the pedestrian further to the periphery of the mobility system. So right now you have the car and motorized travel, which occupies most of the space. And if you kind of focus only on cycling, what can happen if you're not careful, you don't pay attention to the needs of both, is that you give the space that right now is pedestrianized. You kind of like you let these bike kind of encroach on that space, as opposed, and that leaves even less space for the pedestrians, who are now not only at risk from cyclists and as well as via car drivers. And Philippe, if you want to add anything to that.
I think that the thing to consider as well is that as speed increases, more space is consumed. Almost every trip starts and ends with walking, except for those who cannot walk. And so we have to provide the space for that walking. But walking as a transport mode itself is a mode, especially as you pointed out, when connected with public transport. So because it is hidden, in fact, by other modes, it is easy to forget about walking. And that is something that we have to be cognizant, we have to be aware of when we think about how to address walking. At any given time, in any city in the world, most people that are moving around are probably walking. They're just walking for very short trips.
Thanks very much, John and Philippe, for answering my question. We now have some questions from our audience. I'll start with Mateus. Mateus asks how to approach the issue of providing budget towards cycling and walking, especially in extremely car-centered societies. Is there a technical way of addressing such a political issue?
Philippe, yep, please.
So I think budget, of course, is a key issue. But what's interesting is we're often talking about small budgets. And it's hard to, in an era or in an environment where road projects call for very large budgets, to make the point that such benefits can be delivered with much smaller investments. And yet we still have to make that argument. The tools that we use to understand if spending is worth it, cost-benefit assessment, is something that we note in the report has to be reassessed, not only in the way in which it's applied, but also the way in which we value the kinds of benefits that transport delivers. We often focus on time savings, but we will value infinitesimally small time savings for large motorway projects where every person traveling may gain half a second. But altogether, of course, that makes for a lot of time. And that outweighs some of the larger time savings that people could benefit themselves in a walking or cycling trip, but for a fewer number of people. Benefits of 10, 15, 20 minutes. But the other thing as well is that it doesn't easily some of these issues that John raised in terms of how we can create environments that are less prone to violence, that are more comfortable, that are more welcoming. And we have to make sure that our cost-benefit assessment accounts for those, as well as the health benefits that aren't typically captured in cost-benefit exercises. So we have tools that we use, but we have to use them in this way, and we have to use other tools to bring in these benefits into our accounting.
Yeah, and just related to that, just build up on one of the key limitations, the way that a lot of these project appraisals take place today, is the high value that's given to travel time savings, as Philippe mentioned. So even a move from travel time savings to perhaps an accessibility-based sort of is already a step in the right direction. And you have to kind of make sure that you're accounting not necessarily for this aggregate sort of view of like 10 seconds here, 10 seconds there for everyone, but really looking at other things. So that's part of it. And I think just understanding that you have these biases that are already in place that are favoring the car is already a step in the right direction, right? Understanding that if you measure this will kind of result in further kind of creating the issue of having more and more cars in the cities is already like a step in the right direction. But there isn't like an easy solution to all this. I think it really kind of, you have to focus on kind of understanding where do these biases come in place and what methods could be used to kind of alleviate that problem.
Thank you both. This is perhaps a somewhat related question, so feel free to sort of say that you've already answered this. But Tim asks, did your work consider the value for money of active travel versus investments in highway infrastructure or public transport infrastructure? What are the best ways to demonstrate or to measure and demonstrate the value for money of investments in active travel?
And it is similar to the question we've just answered, but I can give a little more detail. We, of course, looked at studies that asked that question: what is the value for money for these kind of investments? And like both John and I said, we have to think about other values besides travel time savings that can be delivered by these projects and by these investments. Health, happiness, fulfillment, all of these matter. And when we look at the overall assessment of those, when they come into project assessment, we see that the return on investment is quite large for these relatively small budgets, anywhere from 28 to 70 times the return on investment. So these are significant and significantly more beneficial investments than equivalent investments in road infrastructure, where road infrastructure is already present and saturated.
Thanks, Philippe. We'll move along a bit. We've got quite a number of questions, and I want to make sure that we cover all of the issues. Thomas asks about methodologies that weight the benefits for non-car users higher than, for example, extra time expenditure for motorists. I think we've gone into that a little bit, so we might just sort of go beyond that. Sorry about that, Thomas. I hope it's already been answered. Lucas asks, what are some recommendations to begin tackling the social aspirations of vehicle ownership, especially in the context of rapidly motorizing countries in the global south?
I think this is a very important sort of question. It's something that is at the core of this, right? It's like, what are we incentivizing? What are the goals? It is very aspirational. You have the issue of car pride, where oftentimes a lot of places people feel that, they're not a person if they don't have a car, because they don't feel that they are kind of seen in society without a car. And I think that it is in these contexts where it's especially critical that we kind of look at how these motor-normative worldviews have formed, because in a lot of these places, and they're quote unquote rapidly motorizing, but most citizens in cities still don't have a car. And a lot of these massive cities, especially in the global south and Latin America, where I'm much more familiar with, they still have massive congestion issues. So obviously the car was developed is really efficient if very few people use it. Already now, very few people use it, and the system is not enough. So I think if you want to change the way that happens, I think you have to kind of adapt how people think about mobility. You have to prioritize other forms of travel. And it cannot be left to only a particular group kind of travels in this way. And I think there you have a sort of social component to it that's really important, because if only those who are perceived as the lesser within societies are the ones that are forced to travel in a particular way, that creates also kind of a problem for these people and a stigma that's associated to it that can then have further negative impacts on their lives. So I think it has to be a comprehensive sort of approach where you look at like the social component, where you also provide people with the possibility to travel in other ways. Because right now, in a lot of these, global south cities, you're not providing people with the adequate sort of infrastructure and the adequate conditions for them to travel actively, safely, and without being disadvantaged, despite the fact that most people are traveling in this way. So again, you need to change this, and you need to give people the possibility to travel in these ways, in a way that isn't disadvantaging them. And that means kind of moving away from the car, because further car development is just going to exacerbate the same issue that we're already seeing.
Okay. Thanks, John. I'll stop you there because we have a lot of questions, and here's one that we could perhaps talk about for a very long time. But the question here is: when using the term violence, are we talking about hazards caused by vehicles, or are we talking about crime levels in specific urban realms? Could you talk just very, very briefly about or unpack a little bit the idea of violence that's explored in the report?
Absolutely. So violence, we're referring to both of the things. So on the one hand, you can have, traffic violence that is caused by cars injuring and hurting others and traveling at speeds that put others at risk and elevate people's sort of stress while they travel, and that is a form of violence that we have to address. But it's not only that. In some contexts, for instance, social insecurity and criminal violence is an issue that restricts how people move and how people feel safely moving around cities. In other contexts, especially if you are, a particular race, if you're a particularly underrepresented group, if you are an LGBT minority, you're also you have this gender-based violence. If you're a woman, you have a gender-based violence where you can have beautiful sort of sidewalks, but if you don't feel safe walking alone, or you don't feel safe walking at certain times or in certain areas, that's restricting your mobility. So really, violence is really systemic violence. Violence is not necessarily intended to cause harm. So in the case of someone driving a car, I don't think they're necessarily trying to cause harm, but they are creating a violent situation and they are inflicting violence on others. Other times it is violence. It is kind of violence as we tend to kind of discuss it more openly in other fields where we're talking about gender-based violence, we're talking about policing violence, we're talking about criminal violence, but these things are all part of systemic violence and limits how we move in societies and limits whether people choose to walk or cycle.
Thanks, John. A question here from Nico. I think, Philippe, you'd like to answer this, but the question is, in one of the figures in the report, the increase in active travel seems to mostly lead to an increase of traffic incident risks. Can you explain why?
In fact, what the figure shows is that an increase in active travel mostly increases the level of physical activity. But in terms of the disbenefits, it does increase the number of crashes. Now, there are two ways to think about this. One is that the number of crashes go up, of course, when more people travel. And we can try to reduce the rate at which this happens. And this is a key message for policymakers, is that we have to look at risk, not just the number of incidents, so that for every kilometer traveled, the probability of getting in a crash decreases. So that's the first thing. The second one is that the physical activity component of active travel creates incredible monetized benefits, both for individuals and society. Now that is a plus, and we see this in the figure. But on the negative side, you have the health outcomes of crashes, of trauma, and you also have the health outcomes of exposure to air pollution. But when we look across the range of studies that have looked at this in detail, what we see is that the positive health benefits of physical activity by far, up to 18 times more, outweigh the combined negative health impacts of exposure to air pollution and crash-related trauma. And this is the key message, that when we travel by walking and when we travel by cycling, we are in fact creating this positive externality that isn't actually captured in a lot of our assessments of what happens when we help increase cycling and walking. But the positive benefits outweigh by far the negative disbenefits. And unfortunately, when activity increases, the number of incidents also increase. It's important to keep that risk down as much as possible.
Thanks, Philippe. A question here from Dana. What role do you see e-bikes playing in both bringing more people to cycling and replacing perhaps a second car or commercial vehicle?
I think, e-bikes obviously have, a strong potential. It's already been impacted, and Philippe can talk about this a little bit more. It's already having an impact in lots of different places. But I think we have to be careful in how e-bikes are brought into the fold. I think, especially when we talk about speed pedelecs, these are traveling at much higher speeds, for example. So how you bring this in to the space where they are is really, really important to keep in mind. And Philippe, maybe you can talk about it a little bit more.
I'm going to say watch this space. We have a report soon coming out on the different safety impacts of micromobility. I will say that the kind of e-bikes where you pedal and that the pedal assist gets you to 25 kilometers an hour is an active mode of travel. There are a number of studies showing that. And even those speed pedelecs that go up to 45 kilometers an hour also provide some kind of activity that is beneficial. But importantly, what they allow people to do is travel further and longer, and especially for people who are not able to do that on their own. So they are an important part of the answer. However, throttled e-bikes where there's no pedaling, has all those accessibility benefits, some of the safety disbenefits, and none of the physical activity benefits.
Okay, thank you very much. We're running out of time. I think we've got time though for one last question. Catalina asks, and I'm going to riff on this a little bit, could you provide a good example in the world of a place that has prioritized active mobility in public policy and done so successfully. Perhaps I could sort of rephrase that by saying, what's your favorite example?
Philippe, maybe you want to start?
Yeah. How many favorite examples are there? Of course, I love cycling, but I'm not going to give a cycling example. I think the car is an expensive entry ticket into mobility. And so the cities that are making it as easy to live without a car as with a car are the ones that should be given as an example. My own favorite is Barcelona, because it is a walking in public transport city, and they have really focused on increasing the quality of walking in that city, increasing the ways in which people can get around on their own 2 feet. So out of the numerous cities I could cite, I'm going to cite Barcelona.
Yep. And in my case, I guess I'll say in Spain, where I think the Pontevedra's example is really, really interesting, especially because it's a smaller city. And a lot of times we focus on these much bigger cities that have a lot of issues. And again, it is focused on walking, but just the way that they've been able to kind of be leaders, because they've already kind of pushed the car a little bit out of their center a lot earlier than a lot of other cities, shows that one, this can happen in small cities, and that, you know, it doesn't have to be centered around the idea of going further and further, but just be allowing people to kind of move into space that they already inhabit.
Thank you both very much. And thank you to everyone for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we did not get a chance to go through all of them, but we really do value your input, and really your interest in this topic means a lot to us. So you can see on your screen here some nice big QR codes so that you can download the report. We've also put in the chat function some links to the report page itself on our website, and to our mailing list if you'd like to stay in touch or to find out about our upcoming reports on this and other topics. So thank you both, John and Philippe, once again. Thank you all for attending, and goodbye for now.